Welcome, everyone, to Alaska Quarterly Review's Reading and Conversation series. I am Ronald Spatz, co-founder and editor-in-chief of Alaska Quarterly Review, and this event is being recorded and will premiere on the Alaska Quarterly Review YouTube channel. Before we begin, I'd like to make a few important acknowledgments. Alaska Quarterly Review gratefully acknowledges the Anchorage Museum for hosting and providing technical support for this event, and the Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts, Alaska Quarterly Review's 501c3 umbrella organization, which makes this event possible. I also want to make a land acknowledgement. Alaska Quarterly Review recognizes the indigenous land on which all Alaskans live, and we are located in Anchorage, and Anchorage is Dena'ina homeland. Dena'ina is the language spoken by the traditional, present, and future caretakers of this land, and land acknowledgement opens a space with gratitude and respect for the contributions, innovations, and contemporary perspective of Indigenous peoples and marks our collective movement towards decolonization and equity. Today, we are delighted to feature Doug Ramspeck. Ramspeck is the author of 10 collections of poetry, 1 collection of short stories, and a novella. His latest books are Smoke Memories, 2025 North Carolina Poetry Society, Blur, 2023 The Word Works, The Book of Years, 2021 Cloudbank Books, Under Black Leaves, University of Indianapolis, Etchings Press, 2020, Distant Fires and Black Flowers, 2020 and 2018 from Louisiana State University Press, The Owl That Carries Us Away, 2018, and Original Bodies, 2016 by Southern Indiana Review Press. He is a 3-time recipient of an Ohio Arts Council Individual Excellence Award. In addition to Alaska Quarterly Review, Ramspeck's poems have also appeared widely in literary journals, including Kenyon Review, Slate, the Missouri Review, and The Sun. Ramspeck has said this about his poetry: I believe in the power of incantation in poetry. I like the feeling of summoning an elevated and musical language, of imagining that this isn't ordinary speech I am creating, but something buoyant. I also like conversational poetry, poems with rhythms of real speech. The key, then, is figuring out how to have it both ways. For me, it means listening for the pounding pulse of the words as I write, a pulse that feels elevated but not strained. I speak my poems aloud as I compose, tasting them in my mouth while also feeling them in my fingertips. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Doug Ramspeck, who will share some of his poems with us today.
Thank you, Ron. I appreciate it, and I appreciate this opportunity to read today. I have found that one of the products of getting older is that I've become increasingly interested in writing about memory, and particularly writing about childhood, though I also do think of myself when I write primarily as a storyteller. And so when I say I'm talking about memory, I'm really comfortable with making some of it up. I find it liberating to focus not really on the literal truth of my life, but on some emotional simulacrum, a way of thinking, sort of fictionalizing the past. And I want to start by reading a poem from my newest collection that'll be out in 2025, Smoke Memories, a poem that is entitled Gift Bones. She, our mother, loaded them in a cardboard box into the trunk of our Impella, where they rattled and shifted and complained on the long drive to Mississippi, where upon arrival at the tiny house outside Biloxi, we wielded shovels in a gelatinous July heat and reburied the bones from our 3 dead dogs, all loved in life, all mourned in death, beside what would later be our mother's flower garden, the graves marked with the clay dogs she fashioned from a potter's wheel and fired in a kiln she had built in that new backyard, a kiln that reminded me, whenever I surveyed it from my bedroom window, of a miniature crematorium. And even after we moved back to the Midwest, we teased our mother that when she died, we would ferry her bones with us wherever we went, would place them in a cardboard box in the back of the car, would listen to that tambourine shuffle as we drove, though our mother insisted she would prefer we constructed from her bones a diorama or assigned her a small cupboard as an ossuary, or whittled those bones into knitting needles or chopsticks or daggers or back scratchers, or merely used them as cudgels, though in the end she was placed in a full-sized crematorium, and we scattered her ashes in the river, where they floated for a time in the current while the bones of the clouds drifted by. None of the events in this poem actually happened, though they feel to me in an odd way that they might have happened or should have happened. I'm drawn to them because in some ways they are fictionalized, but they reveal some of the aspects of what I remember about my family growing up. I do think, though, that storytelling in poetry is very different, of course, than when you write a short story or a novel. And what I often think about when I'm writing a narrative poem is how can I make the conflict as extreme and focused as possible while the language remains as mysterious and indirect as possible. In other words, I sort of think of that contradiction as the core. You don't want to sort of moderate them and balance the two. I sort of feel like I'm trying to be extreme in both, extremely focused, but also sort of extremely wild. And my hope is to have it both ways. So here is a poem where I attempted that family anthem. Sister believes her brothers are the brackish waters of the river, are the possum face of the moon, and she believes that dusk light congeals inside their throats. Once she saw them set fire to the neighbor's cat, saw them dance around the flames, and she dreamed that night that their teeth crumbled in their mouths like stones, that the stars were kicked over and abandoned. And she believes that the years have soot-black tongues, that her brothers have soot-black tongues, and the songs they sing spill bitter salt into the world. Once she might have smothered them in their cribs, might have dropped them like anthems from windows. Once she watched them swim beneath a canker sore of sun, and she thought, let the mud waters carry them away, carry them under. And she dreamed that night that they were standing by her bed, were carefully dousing her with lighter fluid, and they said, we anoint you. And she said, stop. And they said, we baptize you. And she said, you are not my brothers. And they said, hush, hush. My method for writing a narrative poem is often to start by coming up with the title first. It's something that has some emotional content for me, but also has some mystery contained in it. So I don't actually know fully what the title means. And I write, in other words, to discover that meaning. So I start with the mystery of the title, and then I write to sort of answer that mystery. And here are 3 poems that I wrote that way. The first one is entitled The Midwest Gets Drunk and Sings Along to the Radio. My father, as he drove us drunk in his truck, would ride like Pentecostal snakes while a heavy hand thumped the steering wheel as he sang along to his gospel songs, and I watched the blood-red heads of the turkey vultures perching above the dead raccoons along the roadside. And sometimes my father drank and sang in our back porch while I watched the wasp getting drunk with him on the fallen apples in our yard, their tripartite bodies, small altars in the afternoon heat as they moved with languorous slowness, then flew back to their paper hives where they engaged in their communal hum. And still my father sang like God was a trap door that might suddenly open and send us tumbling down. And I woke some nights to hear him arriving home and singing as he stumbled from his truck, singing as the reverie of a distant train horn joined him. And the words he sang, it seemed, were like the paper skin after the snake itself has crawled away. The second poem that I wrote by coming up with the title first. Sometimes I just wake in the middle of the night with a title in mind, and so then I'd get up in the morning and try to write to figure out what in the world that title meant, is Dream of the 10 Rivers. The boys summon vultures like bedclothes, wear them in their sleep, wear them to wade into the dark current of the night, and so their father unfolds his wings inside their dreams, and a wreckage of darkness gathers with a heatless fire, until the brothers exist almost wholly inside wariness, inside boy smells, and they acquiesce to the dreamed hand lashing toward them, to the caress of fists, to the blood taste in the mouth, and the story they tell is of wildfire, of 10 rivers, the water spreading outward like fingers on hands, rivers of numerology, or they tell the story of the blind prophet who sees only that there is no way out, that the years are wax and ghosts, or they sit with their father at the kitchen table, sit with their father on the porch, sit with their father in his truck until sitting becomes a kind of prayer, until the silence of their voices is a kind of prayer. And the vultures draw the pink entrails from the carcasses, conjure perfect strings of them, strings to tie around fingers in remembrance. And the brothers want to swim with their father in the current, to be their father in the current, and also to be the vultures with their shaved heads. And when it snows in winter, the brothers will skate the 10 rivers with sharp blades, blades that draw blood from the ice. And their father will come to them in their dreams, will crack the surface with heavy boots, will whisper comfort as he holds them fast beneath. And then the final poem that I thought about the title first is Father Beats His Sons Beneath an Unmoored Moon. And the ground is wet from the day's rain, and the boys are covenant, and the boys listen for signs and hoot owl calls, and the brothers accept that the moon is an offering, and their father is a bear that emerged from his drunken den, and the sky says, here is the hole in my body from where the days crawl, and the earth says, here is the place from where everyone is born, and the vultures say, tomorrow we will suture the sky to make it fast. And the boys dream that night that they can see through bones of the earth, dream that the night sky is plucked out like an eye, that their father is a garment of clouds or a gathering of crows come morning, so many dark beaks. And the brothers petition the earth to make of the day something fetid and true. And the brothers lie awake and tell themselves that absence is a country, and pain another place on the road of the years, and they can lash the bones of that country into a raft and ride it across the eye hole of the sky's lake. Another way I think about storytelling when I'm writing poetry is to imagine or to begin to write poems in clumps, often about the same set of characters. I think you can sort of see I'm writing about some of the same ones in the poems I've read so far. In this case, from an imagined family that is not sort of really my own, but does kind of reflect certain things about my memories while I was growing up. In other words, I try to listen to these characters. The more poems I write about them, the more I can feel I can kind of hear them, what they're trying to say. And then I try to transcribe their stories or listen to their stories and just sort of write down what I hear them saying. The more I begin to write, the more I feel like I begin to know some of these characters and can write about them that way. Here's a poem, for example, from an early book of mine, Original Bodies, which tells the story, I suppose, of my father leaving my mother, but in a way that I think transforms it, I think, or fictionalizes it, I hope, into a story that's sort of outside of my own experiences. And in fact, I think refers to all kinds of possible absences, including perhaps a death. The title of the poem is Crow Epistles. My father flew away finally with the crows, and then it was winter. We heard him calling sometimes from the woods as snow came down. It was a kind of faith, the falling snow, and always the crows seemed harmless in the trees. The hours were blind beyond the river, an offering of massed leaves and broken earth, the wet smell of mud in the swales, snow prints in our dreams that arced down to the river then back, approaching the back door like tooth marks in an apple. And once we saw a lone black feather dropped and resting in the falling snow, snow that wanted nothing from the field but its erasure. And come morning, the crows were gathering in the distance, watching the snow coming down, the obelisks of their black bodies, motionless, the way you might imagine a prayer arising from the stillness of a breath. Though later, after dark, the nightly drama of the moon conducted its pale sojourn above the trees, where it briefly stayed before drifting its smoke toward the river. I've come to think when I'm writing that storytelling in poetry kind of has two elements, again, different than novels or short stories. And the first one is simply coming up with some kind of vividly presented situation, trying to make the situation feel real and visceral. And the second is then a surprising response to that situation. And surprise can be an unexpected emotion or a mystical or indirect sort of exploration of a response. And here's my attempt, I suppose, at the latter in a poem entitled River Birch. And so the years of our childhood climbed aboard a wagon and made their way into the field. And my brother and I watched them growing smaller and smaller in the distance, shadowless and burning, half blind and wobbling into some original ether. And our father's advice for most things was to suck it up. And he told us that to wear a hat or gloves in winter was a form of giving in, a kind of moral weakness. And once we found our mother kneeling in bare feet by her winter garden, where nothing grew, and that summer fire blight claimed her lone crabapple tree, and our father started the chainsaw, then burned every branch and withered leaf, and we watched the trunk becoming ash. And still the years turned bitter in our throats, and we blamed the crows and the weeds and the clouds. And our thoughts, it seemed, arose from the trickster light of dusk and the fouled waters of the night sky with their ghost milk of stars. And our father looked up sometimes at those crows that waved their dark handkerchiefs against the sky, then oared out on their black boats. Though sometimes the hours appeared to be standing still at a great distance, waiting like a solitary river birch watching some eternal current, as though it might be possible to construct everything from a held breath or a memory of unblemished snow collecting in a distant childhood meadow on a single winter day. For always there seemed an equivalence of things. The sky became the birds, became the rain, became the stars. In the final summer of his life, our father wore a wool sweater despite the heat, his certainty now grown brittle around the edges, like enemy soldiers who end up, decades following the war, laying wreaths together at a cemetery. Another kind of surprise in a story, of course, can be kind of a surprising development or ending, and often I think of poems that way. I'll begin to try to create a mystery at the beginning of a poem, that mystery I don't know the answer to, and then I write it to sort of resolve it, to sort of figure out the answer to that mystery. And so in this poem, when I get to the end, I'm hoping it'll surprise me too, that something will happen that I didn't expect. This poem is entitled Smoke Memories. My mother and I were alone the night the house burned down. I was 9 that summer, and the smell of smoke clung to my clothes. And after the fire, a tree in the yard grew crooked with scoliosis, its back bending away from the remains of the house. The years that followed took on a winding cadence, a torsional writhing, like a ghost snake muscling on its belly through tall grass. And when I married, I knew that my memories were made of smoke. And some days I spoke to the river and to the stillness of the trees, and after our son was born, I believed that to touch his bare feet to a first snow of the season would keep him safe, that seeing a white horse in a dream would pretend that I might die. And some days I stood on our back porch and studied the way the empty fields offered their sorrowful soliloquies. And my wife asked about that crooked childhood tree, and I described how I would climb it every time my father returned to the ruins and assigned blame. And I described for my wife how my mother and I would sit sometimes at the back of my bedroom closet while she smoked, how other times we escaped outside to hide behind the tree while smoke swirled its forgetfulness around us. And how that night, while my father was out, she touched the tip of one of those cigarettes to the living room curtains, then returned to sit beside me on the couch. Because I don't feel limited to literal truth, that I'm really sort of writing about the actual events of my life, and because I'm not really then writing about myself, but some sort of hybrid of sort of real things and made up things, I often feel open to creating characters or writing about sort of generalized experience or what I'm hoping is a kind of universal experience, though obviously the images still can contain for me some kind of personal connection. And here's a poem that I sort of thought of that way when I was writing, called Solace. Our mothers lean against the doorframe of the decades and speak in a vigil of blue cigarette smoke, smiling like a cloud of bees rising above a summer meadow. And the light through the windows blinds them, and they imagine that every heartbeat is a numerology, that memory is forever itinerant and vague. But sometimes they reach out to touch the illuminated air, and the glow is a face or a hand or a fluttering or something buried so deeply it cannot be excavated. And maybe the smoke becomes a bird that batters the ceilings and walls until our mothers whisper, hush, hush. The final two poems that I would like to read are from Alaska Quarterly Review, and I'm grateful for their inclusion in the journal. 13 of my poems have appeared in Alaska Quarterly Review since 2010. I began writing poetry at the age of 50, and so I was still relatively new to the writing of poetry by the time that first acceptance happened, and it meant a great deal to me. I'd long admired Alaska Quarterly Review, and to be included in it was gave me a lot of pleasure and confidence as a writer. I sort of began writing poetry at age 50 without much confidence at all, and acceptances like that sort of helped push me forward. Both the poems, the last two poems I'm going to read, are about a fictionalized version of my mother. The older I get, the more I seem to think about her and write about her. The first one is entitled Tomato Divination. Like a thumb smudging across the wet ink of her mind, the doctor said, and in the weeks after that, a cardinal began battering with territorial insistence at our kitchen window, leaving behind sometimes small offerings of blood. That this was connected to my mother seemed to me at age 7 as clear as the white robes of sky. I pictured what was happening inside her as like the mute erasure of winter snow, or I imagined that her voice was now the dead wisteria at the yard's edge with its poisonous seed pods, or like the yellow jackets flying in and out of an open fissure in the ground. And I remember my mother telling me once, before she lost herself, that everything that stank was holy, the goat droppings and the goat urine in her garden, the rake making prayerful scrapes amid manure. And last night she returned to me out of the sky's rain, knocking on some unseen door inside a dream, knocking like that cardinal pecking at our window, her voice like concentric circles inside the yellow kitchen I'd forgotten. And in her palm was a tomato still clinging to the nub of a vine. And reaching it toward me, she said, "These aren't store-bought. Taste." And finally, Orchard of Years. I keep thinking there is someone out there. Maybe it is Mother in the dress in which we buried her. I wonder if the gray morning light amid the apple trees confuses her. She can't decide where the darkness ends and the day begins. We used to go out there together and watch the wasps getting drunk. They fed on the fallen and fermenting apples. They rolled over on their backs and huzzed. She lifted them sometimes and held them in her palms. She told me once that the apple limbs sagged not because of the burden of the globes, but because they didn't want the fruit to have too far to drop to find the ground. And she said that the story of Eve left out the part where she slipped the noose around her neck and tried to hang herself from God's cursed tree. Mother spent an orchard of years in and out of psychiatric hospitals. In one, there was a view from a window of flowering crabapple trees. I sat with her sometimes, and we talked about how seasons were wanderers, how they could never settle down, but always, eventually, came back home. And in the car on the ride back to the house, my father told me that what kept happening to my mother was like fire blight that darkened and shriveled the leaves until they infected every single other tree and leaf around them. Thank you again for this opportunity to share my work, and thank you to Ron, to Alaska Quarterly Review, for having been kind enough to sort of accept some of my work over the years.